Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. That shows true commitment. I hope I make it worth your while. I do have a few slides. I try to limit myself because, as somebody who loves lecturing, I tend to talk a lot. So I'm going to try to maybe make it a bit more of a conversation.
Rachel, one more thing. I'll just invite everybody to put themselves on mute, except for Rachel, just to minimize anybody's unintentional background noise. Thank you.
That is helpful. Thank you. So let me start by saying one thing more about myself. At Union, I am, apart from teaching theology and ethics, I'm also now the director of our new Master of Art program in public theology, which I'm very excited about. This is me doing a bit of a plug, not so much because I'm trying to lure any of you into the program, but because I want to say this is something that I appreciate about teaching at Union, because public theology is really what the South African anti-apartheid struggle was also about. It was about struggles for justice. It was about taking the message of Christ onto the streets. It was about building a better world. I always like the Jewish expression of tikkun olam, healing the world, that is something that we as Christians are also called to do. So let me jump into a few slides, and then I'm curious, what questions you might have, and we'll take it from there. So I'm going to share screen. All right, so a few quotes. I'm just going to make my own screen dark so I can see on the screen. John de Grootje, who's a well-known South African theologian in the Reformed tradition, he wrote a wonderful book called Liberating Reformed Theology many years ago. He writes that reconciliation is a much misunderstood and elusive notion, one that is abused in rhetoric and difficult to achieve in reality. Yet in a world torn apart by conflict in so many places, reconciliation is a theme that demands consideration in ways that relate to the context in which we live. For Christians, it is a subject at the center of our faith. And that, I think, is a very important emphasis, that this is not something that's sort of optional for Christianity. Reconciliation is at the heart of our faith. The Christian tradition believes that reconciliation is what Christ accomplished for us, because we were distant from God, distant from each other, and that Christ is the one who brings reconciliation with God and with each other. Desmond Tutu, who was the leading figure behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, reminds us that there's nothing easy or lightweight about reconciliation. It's long, it's often a painful journey. It is about telling our stories and listening to the stories of others for the purpose of learning to walk together in hope. And he talks a lot about forgiveness and reconciliation. Those two things go hand in hand. And it is also a choice rooted in the recognition that we are all flawed human beings, all children of God. And I think that there's a certain humility built into the concept of reconciliation there. I'm not going to read all of this to you. I don't know, my slides are really looking odd now. Just make it a little bit like that. The image you see there on the screen is a child during the Anglo-Boer War, when the British put a lot of the children of our nation into concentration camps, a lot of the adults as well, and a lot of the children died. Something like 24,000 children died in those camps, which was about half of all the children in the two so-called Boer republics. And this was at the start of the 20th century. And this is important as sort of the background for the apartheid system, because this trauma, this generational trauma, was built into the system of apartheid. And Helene Opperman-Lewis, who wrote this book, Apartheid, Britain's Bastard Child, she talks about how South Africa's history is a prime example of repeated cycles of humiliation and trauma. Because what happened is that one of the results of this was that the Afrikaners, that would be whites of Dutch descent, decided they will never be ruled by anybody else again. And the way they dealt with that was by creating apartheid, which meant separate development, was the official name for the system. And that is because whites are a minority in South Africa. The problem is that under apartheid, only whites had full citizenship, And then Indians, there are a lot of Indians in South Africa, and also people that were named coloreds. That's a different term from black. It basically was mixed race or people of Khoisan origin and so on. They had some rights, and then the various black tribes had really no tribes, no citizenship in South Africa. The reality of apartheid was this. Let me see if I can just get this up a little bit. Is that better? Okay, so the reality of apartheid was that it was brutal. It was silly in some ways. I mean, if you look at some of these images here, you had two sets of stairs, one for whites, one for blacks, or you would have this black woman who's a nanny to this child, but they can't even sit on the same side of the bench there. So apart from the silliness, there was also police brutality. There was a lot of killing, especially especially after 1960, when the struggle against apartheid became more fierce. The main leader of the most famous leader rather of the struggle against apartheid was Nelson Mandela, but there were other people involved as well, of course. This is Winnie Mandela, who was Nelson Mandela's wife. There were even some whites involved. These lovely ladies over here with their cute hats, they were known as the Black Sash. They were largely white women who actually opposed apartheid. Small group, but a wonderful example of courage. All right, so let's turn a bit to the theology there. So apartheid was supported structurally and theologically by the Dutch Reformed Church. And there's actually a rather complex form of theology. The heart of it was this idea that different ethnic groups are signs of God's order, and that racial mixing was against God because each ethnic group had to develop on its own timeline. So this was a very twisted form of multiculturalism. So if you want to put a sort of an idealistic angle to it, what some of these folks had in mind was that they sought harmony in separation. So it wasn't designed necessarily to be cruel, but of course the reality was that it was cruel and it was delusional, and it was resulted in grave injustices. So there were various forms of theological responses to apartheid: liberation theology, confessional theology, such as the Baard Confession that you should probably be somewhat familiar with, and then Desmond Tutu's Ubuntu theology, which overlaps with the other two. And I'll say a little bit more about Ubuntu, but let me show you a picture of Desmond Tutu, several pictures. Here's this gentleman here, leading figure in the struggle against apartheid, the theological struggle. There's some other well-known church figures here who were in the struggle. This is Alan Boesak, well-known Reformed theologian. He at some point was the president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and under his leadership in the early 80s, apartheid was declared a heresy. And as a result of that, the Synod of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church likewise followed suit and declared it heresy, and which is different from just saying it's a bad theological system. It's saying that it's a theological misstep. And this led to the creation of the Confession of Baard. This gentleman over here, standing next to Desmond Tutu, is the Reverend Baard, white Dutch Reformed minister who was ostracized by the white community because of his resistance to apartheid. So there was a significant, this person here is Nico Koopman, another well-known Black theologian in South Africa. So there was a significant move from within theology all the years in the struggle against apartheid. In our conversation, I can share some stories about that if you want. Anyway, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created after democracy dawned in South Africa in 1994. They decided to not go for Nuremberg-style trials, which is what they did in Germany after the Second World War. They decided that they would rather go for a sort of a religious model, the idea of repentance and forgiveness. So the TRC was created in 1995 with Archbishop Desmond Tutu at the head of this, but also presence from the Dutch Reformed Church, the white Dutch Reformed Church, which had been the main instigator of apartheid theology, also the Methodist Church and so on. They had 3 meetings, one focusing on human rights violations, one on amnesty, and one on rehabilitation, or 3 committees rather. the hope was that they could, in this way, help to heal the wounds of the past, give some dignity to victims. For example, there were people who had to come and say to the family members of victims where their loved ones were buried, that kind of thing. And with the hope that this would enable the nation to move on. The criteria was that you couldn't just come and admit to any crime. You had to show that it was politically motivated. So about 7,000 individuals applied for amnesty, but only 10% met the criteria and received it. And here's the caveat. To further heal the wounds, the Commission recommended that there should be a wealth tax for the purpose of reparations, but that was never followed through on. And this actually is a big problem today. So at the heart of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was this African concept of Ubuntu, which is at the center of Desmond Tutu's theology, which emphasizes the idea that we are not simply individuals, that we are human beings created in and with others, that we are created in relationship to others. So this is really very much, I think if you want to truly understand what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about, you have to understand this essential concept. This was not just about individuals talking together, but this was the idea of that we constitute each other, that to be human is to be in relationship with each other, and that therefore when relationships are broken through violence, through racism, through apartheid, that we are all suffering in our humanity, and that the only way to move forward, whether you are on the side of the perpetrators or on the side of the victims, that the only way that the wounds of this system can heal is if we confess and recreate community. So this is not, in other words, this is not just a sort of a confession and forgiveness scheme. It really is a scheme that is, or a process that is about what it means to be fully human. And I really love this concept of Ubuntu. So I want to say a few words about the Confession of Baard, which is now part of the confessional heritage of the Presbyterian Church as well. At the heart of the Confession of Baard is this concept of reconciliation. This was not the result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it stands in a similar spirit. This was written in the mid-1980s, so a decade before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it definitely reflects the same kind of theological approach, or a similar kind of theological approach. And it emphasizes reconciliation, that Christ's work of reconciliation is made manifest in the church as the community of believers who have been reconciled with God and with one another, and that God has entrusted the church with a message of reconciliation in and through Jesus Christ, that the church is called to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world, that it's called blessed because it is a peacemaker, that the church is witness both by word and by deed to the new heaven and the new earth. So reconciliation, not only reconciliation with God, but also reconciliation with each other, and then also the reconciliation that we bring into this world. This is seen as central of this kind of public theology that was practiced in this time in South Africa. So two things. The first is that the most important thing I think that the TRC did was to create space for truth. And why this is important is I think often if we operate with a way of dealing with past evils by simply with accusation and defensiveness, then there's very little space created for truth. And I think this is often what happens when we engage in conversations on racism, for example, is that it's about accusation and then people become defensive and then we just end right there and nothing happens any further. So what the TRC did well was to create at least some space for truth. Of course, not everybody allowed themselves to participate in that, but there was at least that possibility, right? On the negative side, the main critique today was that it was too reconciliatory, that it was too forgiving, that it was not focused on justice enough. And that brings us back to that last thing I mentioned earlier, namely that they said that there should be, I'll go back to that slide, but there should be a wealth tax for the purpose of reparations. And those reparations were never followed through on. And this is my last slide. So some things for us to think about and other things that you might bring up. The first is, if you look at the history of South Africa, you can see how violent histories tend to perpetuate themselves. South Africa's history is one of colonialism, of systemic racism, of generational trauma, and it has been kind of one cycle after the other of that, and it still plays a huge role. South Africa has pretty high crime rates. It has a huge wealth gap, and those things do not necessarily make for a very stable country. Secondly, that separation does not lead to harmony. That was kind of what the apartheid architects thought. They thought that, well, we are so different, we can't get along, so let's just all separate and sit in our own little heap, and then we will not bother each other. And of course, that is ridiculous. It doesn't work. Thirdly, that the church is created by the reconciling work of Jesus Christ. And I preached this morning that he builds for God a temple of human beings in this world. That the church is called to unity and to the work of justice and reconciliation. Then this lesson, the next one, we exist because of each other. This lesson that I take from the idea of Ubuntu. Just as we belong to God and therefore yearn to be reconciled to God, we also belong to each other, and we need, not just should be, not just suggested to be, we need to be reconciled to each other. The theologian Paul Tillich talks about how love is us being drawn together because we fundamentally belong together, because we are one, that it is not a matter of strangers reaching out, but that there is, at the depth of our humanity, a longing for each other. Second to last one, there's no reconciliation without truth. And therefore, we need to create space for truth. We need to insist on truth. And then finally, this important lesson, we cannot have reconciliation without justice, and that includes restorative justice, and I think, or reparations, as it is called in the United States. A very, very important conversation that should be had. So that's the presentation part. I would love to hear your thoughts or responses or questions.
Rachel, why did 90% of people not qualify for amnesty?
I actually don't know. I think some people, they couldn't necessarily show that their crimes were politically motivated. You really had to show that this was not just something you did out of animus, but that it was because you were part of either, say, for example, you were in the army. Young white men were conscripted to the army in South Africa. Or there were some who came to the TRC who were on the side of the struggle. And so they had to show that they didn't just commit random murder. This was actually political in motivation. So they were pretty strict. Not anybody could just come and say, hey, I robbed the bank last week, can I get some forgiveness here? They really had to prove what was really going on.
And so in a way that would remove sort of the individual guilt aspect, or move it to a deeper, broader aspect, which would theoretically at least allow people to enter into the process knowing that they were part of a larger system. Is that some of the thinking behind it?
I suspect so. I mean, I know that some of this theology has trickled down to me over the years, and this is something I always tell people when we talk about issues of race, for example, is that we so easily make it just about individual guilt, or worse yet, guilty feelings. And this is often a kind of becomes a sort of a defense mechanism, especially on the side of whites. Don't talk to me about racism. I'm sick and tired of it. It's emotionally exhausting. It makes me feel bad, and it's not my fault. And I didn't own slaves, and you know all the rhetoric, right? mean, that's not the point. Of course not. You didn't own slaves. Nobody's saying that. Or it's not all your fault. You were just born. You didn't help that. It's not your fault that you were born in a system like this. But the question is, what are you going to do about it now? So the way I deal with this in my own life is, I didn't create apartheid. I disliked it from a very young age. I became very conscientized about it when I was around 12, 13 years old, as a result of my faith. I have the fortune of having a very, very pious mother who started going actually to a Pentecostal church when I was around 10 or 11. And the Pentecostals at that point, interestingly enough, were the ones who were more racially integrated. It's much like here in the United States. And then later on, they somewhat like kind of lost the way. But so that brought that into kind of the conversation in our household. So by the time I was around 12 going on 13, I became interested in what was going on in South Africa. And in 1983, when I turned 13, there was actually a referendum among whites in South Africa to create a new constitution that would give more rights to some groups in South Africa that were people of color, especially the Indian and so-called colored population. This was a very controversial constitution, but anyway, this did bring about all kinds of political conversations. So for me, I hated the system from a young age. And one of the reasons I hated it was because in the little town I grew up in, there was so primary school in South Africa is the first 7 years, and then high school is the last 5 years. So it's still 12, just the math's different. So we had a primary school for white kids and a primary school for the children of color, but no high school for the children of color. So where were they supposed to go? And what this did, and this was the case in many small rural towns like mine, was that these kids either had no education or no higher than 7th grade, or they had to go and live in other towns with relatives or whomever in order to get high school, which is just a cruel and stupid system. I mean, you just cut off people's life possibilities like that. And so Dirkie Smith, who now teaches at Princeton Seminary and who's actually the guy who wrote the Baard Confession, the actual text, he always said that the worst aspect of apartheid was not the stuff that ended up in front of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Those were the people who committed the violent crimes. But that was not necessarily the biggest part of apartheid. South Africa didn't have a Holocaust or anything of that sort. It was more the daily stuff, the stupid, separate stairs and separate seats and separate beaches and separate neighborhoods and separate schools, which ended up being separate and most certainly not equal, which cut off people's options, which made that there are in South Africa thousands of, say, people who should have been medical doctors who are living on the streets, for example, because their life possibilities were just shut down. That kind of daily oppression is the worst thing. I think that's something that I probably should have, I can put that in my slide next time, because I think that's another shortcoming of the TRC, is that it couldn't deal with those kinds of crimes, because who's going to come and confess about that? What do you have to confess? Because these were sins of omission. Not building that school is a sin of omission. And I think that's a lesson for the United States as well. The way that education is structured in this country, that still keeps education not only segregated, but worse yet, that it keeps it unequal. Anyway, sorry, I can rant about this all night, so I'll stop.
Rachel, this is Paul Verdine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Seems to me in your description of the apartheid system of South Africa and its aftermath, that it has a great deal in common with the segregation system and its aftermath here in the United States. Perhaps the apartheid system was a little more codified, but do you see a lot of commonalities, and did you see some of the things that we could learn from the South African experience applied to this country with this legacy of white supremacy and eugenics?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a lot of overlap. There are some kind of tone differences. that's difficult to capture in language, but definitely, I mean, apartheid was a system of segregation, so it was basically the same in that respect. The main difference in South Africa was that, and I think this is an important lesson for the United States now, it was a racism brought about by fear, because whites are a minority in South Africa. That doesn't excuse it. I don't think for a moment that that excuses it. But that leads to that the main way it manifested was people just wanted to be separate. They wanted to be on their own because they didn't trust one another. In the United States, because racism here is so rooted in slavery, so racism traditionally at least was born from dominance, right? That's shifting. But as we've seen in the last few years, you see as whites near the date where they will no longer be the majority group, you see this, fear that people who are different from themselves will become the majority. And I think we see that in some of the right-wing political movements of the last few years. And that's a dangerous thing, because that leads to a kind of almost even a deeper level of irrationality, because people start thinking with their kind of reptile brains, right? So I think that's a warning. That's very, very difficult to deal with and to argue with. I think in terms of the one important lesson, which I briefly mentioned in my slide as well, is that in the United States, as in South Africa, there has always been a sort of a affirmative action for whites, right? People got their, 3 acres and a mule, 4 acres and a mule, what was it? And when the slaves were released, they didn't get anything, right? So where were their acres and mules? Where was their chance to build a life? We see throughout the 20th century with, things like redlining, or just the way in which when, after the Second World War, and the GIs came back and they got the housing loans and stuff, and very few Black homeowners could, and that actually sets up a whole cycle of poverty that becomes generational poverty.
Right, absolutely.
So that issue of reparations, and this is a big problem in South Africa right now, the youth is very much up in arms. They now see Nelson Mandela as a traitor to their cause. I mean, Nelson Mandela, of all people, right? You would think he would be on a permanent pedestal, but he's not for a lot of the youth in South Africa, because they look into the future and they see no hope because of widespread poverty, which has not been addressed. I have to say the African National Congress was great as a liberation movement, but unfortunately not always. I mean, the current president's very good, but the previous one was awful.
For the purpose of the recording, I'll put her on spotlight and I'll see how that works with the recording. I'm still testing to see how this comes out, but just want to let you know it's a tech note. But anyone else? Questions? I'm sure there are many.
Sarah, I think you're talking, but you're on mute.
I heard him.
Okay. Am I good?
You are.
Yeah. Well, I can
nice to see you.
I took your advice. I did the stuff. I can listen to you forever, as you very well know. But do you see, because I was born into a colonial island country in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think all of us, maybe not now, but at future time, we can go into that. But just as Nelson Mandela is being branded a traitor of sorts, so is Mahatma Gandhi, who we celebrated yesterday. And do you see that tension evolving into something positive? Because for the first time in the United States, where I've lived for more than 50 years, Indo people are sort of gaining a foothold, so to speak, and then again, we have the thing going on in Canada, which used to be the good guy. I mean, where do you see us moving forward as people who are united and reconciling via the church and religiosity and journeys of faith for peace, and not killing each other just because of a tanning situation?
I'm not familiar with the situation in Canada.
Oh, the indigenous children.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Now I am familiar with that. I think in some ways, maybe I think like Hegelian, Hegel, who said that it's always there's always this kind of continuing spiral of historical events. There's no final solving of problems. It's always cyclical, right? So if I think back to when I was a young woman, as I said in my sermon this morning, I started with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then we had the end of apartheid, and wow, it looks as if we are on the way to utopia. And of course that didn't happen. I remember Francis Fukuyama famously wrote a book after the fall of communism that it was called The End of History and the Last Man, something like that, with this idea of, well, we have finally arrived, voila. Of course, that's not feasible. We are never going to arrive in a utopian world where the struggle does not arise time and time again. And I actually think in the last few years, and not just because of the rise of right-wing sort of neo-fascist movements, but also in other ways. I think even among the left, a certain level of authoritarianism and intolerance and so on. But I think we are once again going towards a place where we need to create new narratives of justice and of reconciliation. The main thing we cannot do is to try to bury the past. And that is something that I do learn from the TRC. We have to talk about the children who disappeared. We have to talk about police brutality in the United States. We have to talk about, fill in the blank of, so there are so many. How we talk about it, I think, is important. And that is something, again, that I take from the TRC. What we need to do is that this is not about, pointing fingers and canceling each other out and all of that, because that doesn't solve anything. That gives people a short-term high. And this is especially a risk now with our online presence, right? There's so much kind of online politics going on, which is just empty gesturing and, Facebook comments and likes and stuff of that sort. That's not really helpful. We need to find a way to say, these are the problems we as a human race are facing together. And the problems we are facing together are increasing. I mean, we are facing a century where climate change is going to become more and more of an issue. And the church has really not led very well in that so far. And I include my own lack of attention so far in my own career. So this is all over the place. I don't have a perfect answer for you because I don't think there's a perfect answer. The main thing is that we haven't arrived. We arrive cyclically, right? There are moments of hope and liberation. There was this phrase in Southern Africa, not just in South Africa, I think it's in Portuguese, a luta continua or continua, I'm not sure how to say it. I think it's similar in Spanish. The struggle continues. And that's probably one of the most marked images that I remember from my youth, right? People marching in the streets with fists and saying the struggle continues. I think that's where we are. The struggle continues. And what we will need, as always, is Chuck can help me out. He's the pastor. That verse that talks about being innocent as doves, wise as serpents, and innocent as doves. I think that's what we need, maybe. Wisdom.
All right, okay, Dr. Baard, may I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so as you know, our media is heavily polarized right now with the head bashing, finger pointing, launching 100-mile-per-hour partisan bombs at each other. I don't think this is very healthy for us as a society. What can we do to fix this, to have less of this? Can anything be done?
Well, I think the TRC opens maybe one model, maybe not the only one, but you're asking a tremendously difficult question. You're absolutely right that this is not healthy. This is not progressive. I like progressivism in a sort of an old-fashioned sense of we constantly need to strive to do better, while we constantly need to move forward and not backwards. And I think sometimes what happens now is we've kind of become regressive, even in the name of our progressivism, because it's all about pointing fingers and being angry. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and I don't know where I'm going with this in my own thoughts, but I wonder if, with COVID the last year and a half, goodness, it's been so long already, feels like an eternity, and with people being home and with people feeling anxious, and then also economic structures that leave people, especially younger generations, even more in flux. I mean, the kind of stability that previous generations knew, younger generations don't know anymore. Plus the free flowing of information on the internet, far too much, most of it misinformation. I think it puts us on a very sort of unstable, kind of a constantly in flux kind of basis. And I wonder if some of our anger that we are seeing in political discourse, not only on the TV channels, but also online. I mean, if you want to raise your blood pressure, just go and check out some YouTube comments, right? I mean, it's just the height of aggressiveness most of the time. I wonder to what extent this kind of aggressiveness has to do with not only the anonymity of the internet, but also with sort of an anger that people are feeling because they're feeling afraid. And again, this goes back to the question that Paul asked me about the similarity between racism here and in South Africa. Fear leads to all kinds of problems if it's not addressed properly, right? Is it Yoda in Star Wars that talks about how fear leads to anger and anger leads to hate, or vice versa, and then that leads to the dark side. I should get my Yoda quote straight on this, but I think there's a certain kind of theological wisdom in that. And I think we need to address that. Part of truth speaking would be to talk about what is it that we really are afraid of. I don't see that kind of vulnerability happening in the public sphere. So maybe the churches should find a way to create that kind of space. But yeah, I don't have, again, just this was my answer to Tara, I don't have a full answer for you because one person cannot. I think this is something we need to think about. How can we create spaces where we can do something different from what we see out there?
Space for vulnerability, wonderfully put. Others?
Yeah, I just thought of that. I should have, again, next time I'm putting vulnerability into my slides.
Yeah. I think it says Jean Dudek raised her hand. So
Yes, I raised my hand. Hello. I've recently been thinking about the story in Genesis about the curse of Ham, which is a really weird story because there's such a big difference between what the text says and what people think that it means. But I was just wondering if that story or misinterpretation of that story, was that part of the background, either on the religious side or on the secular side, about the formation of apartheid?
That's a wonderful question. That is such a weird text, and I'm going to tell you a few stories about that. I used to teach that text deliberately to my humanities students at my previous job. So for those who are not in the know, the way that text has often been used to justify to justify racism, and specifically slavery, and this was actually done in the United States in the 18th, 19th centuries as part of the justification for slavery. It was said that, when Noah, he gets drunk and he lies naked in his tent, and then his son Ham sees him naked, and then he tells his brothers, and then when Noah is sober again, he's really mad at him, and he tells Ham, your children will be destined for slavery. He basically curses him with generational slavery. And so then eventually the story was read, especially if you read the story as literal history, which they did for a long time. This was seen as the origin of all of humanity, these sons of Noah. And so according to this classical historical interpretation, the people in the Middle East are the descendants of Noah's son Shem. That's why we call them Semites, the descendants of Shem. And then the people who are in the part of Europe that they knew about at that point, they were the descendants of Japhet. We call them Europeans. They're not called Jeffersites or something. They probably should have been. And then the descendants of Ham, according to this kind of legendary take, moved to Africa. And so by the time the North Atlantic slave trade happened, there was this belief that was actually propagated by some preachers here in North America that it's completely legitimate to enslave Africans because they are the descendants of Ham. And this was known as the Hamitic hypothesis. So two tales to that story. The one is, no, it didn't play a significant role in South African apartheid. There were some, definitely some who read it like that, but the theology of apartheid was actually in a twisted sick kind of way, quite sophisticated. It was rooted in the thinking of the Dutch theologian and prime minister in the 19th century, Abraham Kuyper. And he operated with this idea of spheres of sovereignty or something like that. I get allergic reaction when I hear Kuyper's name, so I don't read him much because of the history, his role in apartheid theology. One of the paradoxes of the apartheid system was that it actually believed in the fundamental equality of all people. It's very paradoxical. It did believe, however, that not all cultures are on the same level of development yet. This is why I say it was a twisted form of multiculturalism. And one author, I forget who it was now, once said that this was the Trojan horse built into the apartheid system, because it left open the door for people eventually being completely equal. Now, this was still racist, no doubt about it. This is still but it's a kind of a different flavor, right? You can hear there's a different sort of logic behind it. Ultimately, it all comes down to plain old racism, right? If you really boil it down to its roots. But so the Hamitic hypothesis was not central to it at all, except sometimes, you would hear people say something about that, but definitely not officially. The Hamitic hypothesis, by the way, had a strange twist in Rwanda in the 1990s. So when the Germans first arrived in Rwanda in the 19th century, they kind of stood on a hill and looked at the people down below in the valley, they noticed that there were some people, the Tutsi, who had slightly different kinds of bone structure from the Hutu. So the Hutu tended to have different facial features. And so the Tutsi had facial features that resembled more those of Europeans. So then they developed this bizarre theory that the Tutsi are actually the descendants of Ham. So they are really white, just now black, right? Listen to the twisting of kind of racist logic there, right? And then they said the Hutus are this indigenous form of Africans, and they use the N-word to describe them. So this is a twist, right? Whereas in the Hamitic hypothesis that justified slavery, the Africans were seen as inferior because they are cursed for slavery. In this weird kind of German interpretation of Rwanda, is they now made the so-called descendants of Ham, the Tutsis, the superior group because they're really Caucasian. They're really from Europe. And they then structured Rwandan society according to this. This is known as the second Hamitic hypothesis. This, of course, led to great resentment on the side of the Hutu. And then when the Belgians took over somewhere early in the 20th century, they actually, because they were on the side of the oppressed, they took the side of the Hutu. So the Hutu became more powerful than the Tutsi because they were seen as the oppressors. They now became very hated. And if you look at some of the rhetoric happening in Rwanda leading up to the Rwanda genocide, the Hutu radio stations, for example, would say that the Tutsi should be sent back to Ethiopia because it was this belief that they had come from Ethiopia, that they were invaders, they don't belong in Rwanda, which is of course nonsense, but this was the result of the colonialist rhetoric that made this totally absurd distinction between two groups of Black people in a Black country in the middle of Africa based on a bizarre reading of the story of Noah. So there you go. That's your kind of not so quite fun fact for the evening. It is just a bizarre it was also tied up with the so-called scientific racism of the time. This idea that, well, what do you do with the fact that there are some advanced civilizations in Africa? I mean, how do you match that up with your racism? It was just a struggle for these people. I mean, it's just bizarre. Racism, I think if there's one tool we should really use more to undermine it, is to show people just how stupid it is. It's just stupid. If you think, I mean, this is something I thought about when I was a kid. Why is it that we make this absurd distinction among people based on the amount of skin pigmentation they have? I mean, that's just an accident of where most of their ancestors lived. Did they live closer to the sun, so they needed more skin pigmentation? Or did they live closer to, I don't know, Sweden, and therefore needed less skin pigmentation? So that's it. And yet we've built entire structures. And it's because it's really about exploitation, right? It's ways, and this is something that all of these stories, all these things have in common. It's about exploitation. Colonialism was about exploitation. Slavery is about exploitation. And that's still true in other ways today. We've just become maybe a bit more subtle. Anyway, sorry, I can ramble about this all night, so I'll stop. I love stories in Genesis.
Dr. Baard,
Yes,
this is Paul Verdine again. May I ask another question?
of course.
One of my great frustrations as a progressive Christian in this country is the fragmented witness that we have with our own government. The fact that we have so many different denominations in this country, including the Presbyterian Church USA and many others. So you know their names as well as I. But because there are so many of us, we don't get together and have a consistent progressive Christian witness in Washington and other seats of government in this country. What has ever happened to the ecumenical movement? Isn't it time for a new reformation? Thank you.
Wow, no, that is a question I'm not sure I want to answer while I'm being recorded. That's a huge one.
That's a hot topic, right?
Well, let's put it this way. One of the main slogans of the Reformation was Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda, right? The church reformed, always reforming. So
Right.
that's my sneaky way of getting around your question and saying, yes, let's continue reforming. So I think one of the deep tragedies, and this is something, I mean, I taught at a Catholic university for 15 years. I never felt tempted to become Catholic because women priests. But one thing that I saw there was that because the Catholic Church is just huge and they have a clear structure of leadership, so they have a very strong public voice, that has actually strengthened them in sometimes really good ways, sometimes not in ways I would agree with, but in other ways very good. Protestantism, unfortunately, because we are so prone to just split apart based on the simplest arguments sometimes, we have weakened our witness. And this is part of what I preached about this morning, right? Is that when we build these walls amongst ourselves, we become less, or we make God's presence less powerful in the world, less present, less visible. The only way forward for that would be more and more kind of work on ecumenism. The one positive thing I see, and this is where I would suggest at some point you invite my dear colleague James Taneri, who is our professor of world Christianity. He's much more informed about this than I am. But the one hope that I do see is that Christianity is increasingly a religion of the global south, right? Of Africa, Latin America, Asia. And there, these old denominational differences don't always make sense to people because they just don't. Now, one thing that does unite many of the churches, for example, in Africa, would be a sort of a Pentecostal approach to things, which is not necessarily bad, provided that the theology doesn't get left behind, because the Pentecostalism is a force for kind of a reinvigorated church, but it can also, when it becomes coupled with fundamentalism, that becomes problematic. And we see that often here in the United States. So I don't see an easy way forward, but I do think that denominational differences matter less and less to people. I mean, even at our seminaries now, I mean, we're still, I think, majority Presbyterian at Union, but in my classes right now, I'm teaching a course on theology and the arts, and I have not a single Presbyterian in there. Probably because Presbyterians don't really do art that much, I don't know. But I have a Catholic, some Episcopalians, some Pentecostals, and some others that I'm not sure about. Methodists, I think there's one. So really quite an ecumenical group. And I think that's positive in some ways. I mean, I want the Presbyterians in my class too. But I think it's positive that we are doing our training together.
Right.
And discovering that we have more in common than what separates us. And that includes also Catholics and Protestants, not just within Protestants.
Thank you, Rachel. And I want to say that what we're doing on Wednesday night with a book study with the church across the street, which is completely different from Presbyterians, that one a good example. Any others who have not shared and focused on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the learnings from that? We just have a couple more minutes. I would like to, if there's any opportunity for anyone else who has yet to ask a question.
I was just going to make a comment. It doesn't have to do with the Truth and Reconciliation, but the comment that Rachel made about skin color being a stupid way to differentiate people. There actually is, and when I say actually, I'm not, not supporting racism, but the propaganda that goes along with that includes not just skin color, but it identifies it with other physical and psychological characteristics like IQ and so on. There are a lot of details if you go into, a lot of people go into this. I spent weeks reading David Duke's webpage about 20 years ago. He had direct links with Nazi propaganda and all sorts of things. And this, for example, the Virginia Department of Agriculture published a pamphlet in 1925, which said that it's all right to beat black people because they have thicker skulls and they don't feel the pain as much and they don't get damaged as much from the beatings. This kind of ridiculous stuff is associated with the skin color and genetics and so on. The people that get into this deeply really have bent minds. It's awful hard to reach someone like that on a logical basis. But I think the Truth Reconciliation thing, I did have some questions about long-term consequences of that, but you mentioned some of that. Thank you very much for your talk. It was wonderful.
No, you're absolutely right that it's about more than race. I mean, I was kind of saying this is what it boils down to in the end, but in South Africa too, one of the people I had on my screen earlier, Nico Koopman, he's a friend of mine, he's a Black theologian, and we were once sitting in the cafeteria at Princeton Seminary where I actually met him. He was visiting there, and we put our hands next to each other, and our hands are exactly the same color. And yet in South Africa, I'm white and he's black. Now, we're actually both a little bit mixed because most South African whites are not, only white. I have black ancestors, including slave ancestors from West Africa and so on. But it's just this, it's not just skin color. It's also, I mean, some of the ridiculous and humiliating aspects of the beginnings of apartheid in South Africa was that they would sometimes even separate families from within the family, based on who could pass as white and who would not pass as white. Keep in mind that in the United States, racism often operated with the one-drop rule. So if you were not, you could be pretty pale, but still count as black if you were just a little bit, black, or whatever that might mean. In South Africa, because whites are a minority, they tried to make as many people pass as white as possible. So it was sort of an opposite way of doing things, but with the same purpose, basically. So they would look at nose shape, they would look at how curly the hair is. I mean, all those ridiculous things. And it relates to some of the things you referenced, which had to do with so-called scientific racism. This idea that, skull sizes differ or some skulls are thicker or such nonsense. I mean, to this day, there are doctors who believe that black people don't feel pain as much. To this day, in the 21st century. It's just utterly ridiculous. There's something else you mentioned I wanted to comment on, but now I forgot. So hopefully that's enough.
Yeah, well, we're at 8:02, and I want to be considerate of the time of everyone. Again, anyone else who has not shared, touching on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I would like to ask, are there any incredible stories or books that just talk about the intense personal transformation that happened from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? I know it exhausted Archbishop Tutu. I know that that there was not a lot of the punishment, the justice was not seen as being as robust as it could have been because of the amnesty granted. Are there any, where would you refer us, Rachel, in terms of finding the powerful, life-transforming stories that would inspire us, not simply illumine historically, but inspire us transformatively into and being the church today? Are there collections of these stories? Is there a place to go where we can mine the wisdom of this?
I wish you had to ask me that question before the time, because I could have thought about some a little bit more. I'm trying to think. I think Ankie Kroch's Country of My Skull. She's a white woman, a poet, very progressive. I think that might be one. I don't know if it deals directly with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You spell her last name Krog, and the title is Country of My Skull. Then, in terms of theology, I read mostly theology, so it's difficult for me to point you to other books that might, be more about storytelling. If I think of some, I will forward it to you, and you could always, forward it to people. But apart from Desmond Tutu's work, somebody that I always recommend is Alan Busak. More in general, not simply about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was one more I was thinking about. Now, what was it? I can't think right now.
Bob, you had a quick question to ask?
Yeah, actually, I'll jump in on that one there. My wife and I are sitting here thinking of a couple of things. There's one called A Human Being Died That Night by Pumla Madizikela. I can't remember her full last name, but she's a professor. She was a staffer, I believe, on the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's an excellent book about her interactions with one particular prisoner who was convicted of some crimes committed during the apartheid years. There are also a couple of books out on the Amy Beale story. Amy Beale being a Fulbright scholar who was murdered in Guguletu in August of '93. And her parents appeared as in front of the TRC and forgave the 4 young men who were convicted of killing Amy. And there's a movie and there's a book, I can't remember the names about that. And there's a Black South African author who's written a number of books. I'm trying to think, I'm getting old. She wrote a book about the story, From a Mother's Mother.
Oh.
It's one of the best books I've ever
Mother.
read, Mother to Mother.
Sindiwe.
Yeah, Sindiwe Magoma. It's one of the best books I've ever read, left me in tears a number of times. A good place to start is a personal story. It's really written from the perspective of a mother of one of the killers of Amy Beale, and a great place to start. Also, the TRC materials are available. I read them a number of years ago. It's probably not a great read for most people, but I found it really fascinating at the time.
So the person you referenced who wrote A Human Being Died That Night is Pumla Gobodo Madikizela. That's Gobodo is G-O-B-O-D, G-O-B-O-D-O, then hyphenated, and then M-A-D-I-K-I-Z-E-L-A, Pumla Gobodo Madikizela. And then the other book you said is what, Mother to Mother?
Yeah, I think it's Mother to Mother by Sindiwe Magoma. We got rid of all our books when we were tired. Now we're just frantically looking for one of them to see if we still have it. But
Mother to Mother, and yeah, the author is Sindiwe, that's S-I-N, like sin, and then Diwe, D-I-W-E, that's one word, and then Magona is M-A-G-O-N-A. I appreciate that because I have not actually read, sort of these life experience books around the TRC. I probably should. I remember the Amy Beale incident. It was, it sent a lot of shockwaves around South Africa. At that point, I think many of us had become so used to all these deaths happening. Just before the end of apartheid, was it 92, 93, there was a very well-known anti-apartheid leader who was killed. And people thought that the negotiations would come to an end when he was killed. Now, I had his name in my head a moment ago, but it's been a long day for me, so my head is not working at the moment.
I think you're talking about Chris Hani.
Yes, and thank you. And I know his name, it just was out of my head. And it was very interesting. I went to his memorial service in Stellenbosch, and it was one of the most interesting experiences I ever had, and where I really saw the power of the church. So there were memorial services held for Chris Hani all over the place. In Stellenbosch, there was this large church, which used to be the student church as well. It could hold 2,000 to 3,000 people at a time. And on a Sunday night, usually there would be 2,000 to 3,000 people at a time. It was always wonderful. And on this day, it was packed. It was just literally at least 3,000 people in there. Mostly Black people, and then maybe about 100 whites. I was one of them. So that was an interesting experience to really, be there in that moment. And you could feel the pain of the people. You could feel the anxiety and the anguish and all of that. And there were different speakers who came up and talked to people. And then Alan Bussack, the Dutch Reformed Black theologian, whose most famous book is Black and Reformed, he came up and he started speaking to people. And what he did was, it was like a miracle. He's a wonderful orator. He really knows how to work a crowd. And he took the people's pain and anguish, and he was almost like a puppet master who could go like this with the people in there. And he recognized their pain, he recognized their anguish. And then he ultimately, and in a way that I cannot mimic, it was with strong rhetoric. I mean, he definitely would give even the wonderful preachers in the African American legacy a run for their money, because he has that same kind of rhetorical ability. But he was able to say that if we let these people who killed Chris Hani win, then we all lose. If we let the bad guys win, if we give in to the justifiable anger that we feel, then we can never move forward, because that's when you end up in spirals of violence. And he didn't give this intellectual way of, do this intellectual thing, but he did, that was the essence of his argument. And you could feel the healing begin. And I think that kind of attitude is what's at the heart of the whole movement in South Africa, with the anti-apartheid church struggle, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and so on, was this sense of, this is a country with generations of trauma, the trauma that started even before apartheid, generations of all kinds of trauma. How on earth do we move forward and build something constructively, while recognizing the bad things that have been done, but in such a way that we don't just perpetuate the cycles of violence. And so I think that was what was at the heart of the whole movement from the beginning.
How powerful the nonviolent way of the cross, when the violence of the cross has become so central to some sort of redemption in our world. Thank you so much. And this is truly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is truly a great example of that, trying to find the way of the cross. And talking about Christology and soteriology. Thank you everyone for joining us. Rachel, thank you so much for
Thank you.
your time effort with this morning, this evening, and blessings to you and your, I know, a busy week you have ahead. A couple of
2 classes tomorrow, yeah.
classes
So it's gonna
tomorrow
be
and a
like
couple
that.
of evenings as well. All right. Very
Thank
thankful
you.
to everyone for joining us. And God bless you each and every one. Let's close with a brief word of prayer. We give you thanks, oh God, that there are examples, models of the way of the cross when so many are still looking to the violence of the cross to solve the world's issues. We live in this world that has that myth of redemptive violence, that violence can somehow redeem violence, and we keep miming that cross over and over and over again. Let us pick up that heavy cross of God that is nonviolence, but yet that nonviolence be resistant to injustice, that wonderful combination of love and justice go hand in hand into the future, and we may learn from places and spaces such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We give you thanks for Rachel's presentation tonight. In Jesus' name and on the Spirit's way we pray. Amen.